In Siberia, there is a kind of cold that does not feel natural anymore. It does not bite. It does not sting. It waits. Quietly. Patiently. As if the world itself has already decided you are not supposed to survive there. At -71 degrees Fahrenheit, even breathing becomes dangerous. The air cuts through your lungs like frozen glass. Metal freezes to exposed skin in seconds. And if you fall asleep outside for too long, the snow does not wake you up again. Ethan Walker knew all of this before he ever stepped into the storm. He was 34 years old, born in Colorado, raised on stories about men who crossed mountains alone and disappeared into places maps could barely explain. For years he had chased remote landscapes with a camera and a backpack, searching for silence far away from cities and highways and people. But Siberia was different. Siberia did not care why you came. The storm began just after sunset. At first it looked harmless, only thin curtains of snow moving across the endless white forest. Ethan tightened the hood of his parka and checked the GPS clipped to his chest. The blinking signal flickered once, then disappeared completely. Static crackled through his radio. No signal, no trail markers, nothing except snow stretching for miles beneath a sky turning darker by the minute. The wind changed next. It came low through the trees with a sound that barely resembled weather anymore. It sounded alive. Ethan kept walking anyway, his boots sinking knee-deep into fresh powder while frost gathered along his eyelashes. Every breath burned. Every step felt heavier than the last. Somewhere in the distance, branches snapped. Ethan stopped instantly. The forest went silent again. Too silent. Out there, silence was never comforting. Silence meant something was listening. He scanned the white horizon, but the storm erased everything beyond 30 feet. His flashlight beam disappeared into swirling snow like it was being swallowed whole. Then he saw them. Tracks' massive prints pressed deep into the frozen ground beside a cluster of black pine trees. Fresh. Ethan crouched carefully, brushing snow away with a gloved hand. The paw prints were enormous, bigger than any wolf he had ever seen, for separate trails moving in the same direction. His stomach tightened immediately. Siberian tigers. He had read about them before coming here, but reading about a predator was different from realizing one might already be close enough to smell you through the storm. Ethan stood slowly, trying to calm his breathing, but something else caught his attention. Another set of tracks crossed the tiger prints. Larger, wider apart, heavy enough to sink deep through the packed snow. Moose tracks, huge ones. For a moment, the forest felt frozen in time itself, as if two giant forces had moved through the same place only minutes apart. Then Ethan heard it again. Not wind this time. Breathing. Slow. Deep. Somewhere beyond the storm, something enormous was watching him. Ethan forced himself to keep moving, even though every instinct told him to stop and listen. The sound had vanished again, swallowed by the storm so completely that he almost convinced himself he imagined it. But deep down he knew better. Nothing survived this long in Siberia by imagining danger. The forest around him had changed. The trees grew thicker now, their branches heavy with layers of ice that creaked softly whenever the wind pushed against them. Snow drifted sideways across the ground like smoke. Visibility dropped lower with every passing minute until the world became nothing but white shadows and black tree trunks. Ethan checked the thermometer clipped to his pack strap. -71 degrees Fahrenheit. The display flickered weakly before dimming again. Even the batteries were starting to fail. His gloves felt stiff as stone. He flexed his fingers inside them, trying to keep feeling in his hands, but numbness was already spreading through his arms. He needed shelter fast. Not tomorrow. Not in an hour. Now. Then the wind shifted again, and with it came a smell that froze him in place more effectively than the cold ever could. Musk. Damp earth. Animal. Clothes. Ethan slowly turned his flashlight toward the trees beside him. At first he saw nothing except snow swirling through darkness. Then something moved between the pines. Massive. Silent. The shape stood taller than any horse Ethan had ever seen. Thick shoulders. Long dark legs. Antlers spreading outward like frozen branches. The bull moose stared directly at him from less than 40 feet away. Neither of them moved. Ethan felt his heartbeat thudding painfully beneath layers of frozen clothing. He had encountered moose before in Alaska years earlier, and he remembered exactly what guides always warned him about. A moose was not a gentle forest animal. especially not a bull this large. In deep winter, hungry and exhausted animals became unpredictable. One wrong movement could trigger panic. Or worse, the moose lowered its head slightly, steam rolling from its nostrils into the freezing air. Snow gathered along the thick fur covering its neck and shoulders, making the animal appear almost unreal against the storm. Ethan slowly backed away, one careful step at a time. The moose did not charge. It did not retreat either. It simply watched him. Then came another sound from somewhere deeper in the forest. A low growl. Faint, but unmistakable. Ethan felt every muscle in his body tighten instantly. Another growl answered from farther away. Then another. The storm had hidden them until now. He swept the flashlight wildly across the trees, but the beam only caught flashes of blowing snow and shifting shadows. The moose reacted first. Its ears lifted sharply toward the darkness behind Ethan. The animal stomped once into the snow, powerful enough to shake loose frost from nearby branches. Ethan turned slowly and finally saw them. Eyes. Several pairs reflecting dimly through the storm. Low to the ground, moving silently between the trees. The tigers were circling. Ethan stumbled backward instinctively, but his boots slid against buried ice beneath the snow. Pain shot through his ankle as he crashed hard onto the frozen ground. His flashlight disappeared into the darkness. For one terrible second, all he could hear was the wind and the slow crunch of footsteps moving closer through the forest. Then the bull moose stepped forward and placed itself directly between Ethan and the approaching shadows. The storm seemed to pause for a moment, as if even the wilderness was waiting to see what would happen next. Ethan lay frozen against the snow, his injured ankle throbbing beneath layers of numbness, while the bull moose stood over him like a living wall. The animal did not make a sound. It simply faced the darkness beyond the trees where the glowing eyes continued to move slowly through the storm. Ethan could barely breathe now. Fear mixed with cold until he could not tell which one hurt more. The tigers never rushed forward. That was what terrified him most. They moved carefully, patiently, vanishing behind curtains of snow before appearing again somewhere else. One pair of eyes disappeared to the left, while another emerged farther back between the pines. They were spreading out around them. Hunting. Ethan forced himself onto one elbow and searched desperately for the flashlight he had dropped. His fingers brushed frozen snow, broken branches, ice, but nothing else. The wind carried another low growl across the forest, deep enough that Ethan felt it in his chest more than he heard it with his ears. The moose reacted instantly. Its massive head turned slightly toward the sound, while steam poured from its nostrils in thick white clouds. Frost clung to its antlers like shards of glass. Ethan realized then how exhausted the animal looked. Snow covered its back almost completely. One side of its fur appeared darker beneath the ice, as if it had already survived some brutal struggle long before finding him. Yet it still had not walked away. Another shape moved suddenly between the trees. Closer this time. Ethan finally saw part of one tiger through the storm. Massive shoulders slipping silently through the snow. Orange fur barely visible beneath layers of frost and darkness. The animal stopped just beyond the edge of the flashlight beam, lying half-buried nearby. Watching. Waiting. Ethan tried to stand, but pain shot through his ankle hard enough to nearly drop him back into the snow. His body felt weaker every second. The cold had started reaching deeper now. Not just his skin, his thoughts. He struggled to focus on simple things like breathing and keeping his eyes open. Hypothermia did not always feel violent. Sometimes, it felt quiet, gentle even, like the cold was slowly convincing your body to stop fighting. Ethan knew that feeling was dangerous. People froze to death because they became tired, comfortable, ready to rest. He clenched his jaw and forced himself to stay awake. The moose stomped the snow again, louder this time. The nearest tiger paused immediately. For a few seconds, neither animal moved at all. Predator and prey staring at each other through blowing ice, while Ethan remained trapped between them. Then something changed. The tiger slowly backed into the trees. Not retreating completely, just disappearing from sight again. The others vanished too. One by one, the glowing eyes faded into the storm until only darkness remained beyond the forest. Ethan exhaled shakily, but the moose did not relax. In fact, it looked even more alert now. The animal suddenly turned its head toward the north ridge above them. Ethan followed its gaze, and felt his stomach drop instantly. Through the blizzard, barely visible against the white horizon, something else was coming down the mountain. Not animals this time. A wall of snow moving unnaturally fast through the trees. At first, Ethan thought the storm was playing tricks on his eyes again. The white mass rolling down the mountain looked unreal through the blizzard, almost like a cloud falling toward the forest. But then the ground beneath him began to vibrate softly. Snow dropped from nearby branches. The sound followed a second later. Deep. Endless. Like the entire mountain was breaking apart somewhere above them. Avalanche. Ethan forced himself upright despite the pain shooting through his ankle. The cold hit him instantly, sharp enough to steal the air from his lungs. He tried to move faster, but his right leg dragged through the snow uselessly. Every step felt slower than the last. The wall of snow kept coming. Trees vanished inside it one after another, while the roar grew louder across the frozen valley. The bull moose turned immediately and started moving through the forest. Not running wildly. Deliberately. As if it already knew where to go. Ethan stared at the animal for one stunned second before realizing it was glancing back. Toward him. Waiting. Another crack thundered from the mountain ridge above. Snow exploded through the trees less than 100 yards away now. Ethan stumbled after the moose as fast as his body allowed. Branches whipped against his jacket while the storm swallowed everything behind them. The moose pushed through deep snowdrifts effortlessly, its huge body clearing a path between the pines. Ethan followed the tracks desperately, breathing harder with every step. His chest burned. Ice had formed along the edges of his scarf and beard. He could barely feel his hands anymore. Then his injured ankle gave out completely. Ethan crashed face first into the snow. The impact knocked the breath from his lungs. For one terrifying second, he could not move at all. He heard the avalanche crashing closer through the forest behind him like an ocean wave tearing through trees. Panic flooded his body. He tried pushing himself up, but exhaustion dragged him back down. His muscles no longer obeyed him properly. The cold had drained too much energy already. The moose stopped ahead of him. Ethan looked up weakly through the snow and watched the animal return. It approached slowly, steam rolling from its nostrils while ice clung to its fur in thick layers. Ethan expected it to flee any second now. Any normal animal would have. But the bull lowered its massive head beside him instead. The antlers brushed against Ethan's shoulder carefully, almost guiding him upward. Ethan grabbed a nearby tree trunk and forced himself back onto his feet. The avalanche roared somewhere behind the storm, close enough now that the ground shook beneath the snow. The moose turned again and moved deeper into the forest. Ethan limped after it blindly. Then suddenly the trees opened ahead. A narrow rock formation appeared through the blizzard, half hidden beneath layers of snow and ice. The moose disappeared behind it. Ethan followed moments later, just as the avalanche swept through the forest behind them. Snow thundered past the opening of the rock shelter in a violent white blur, while freezing wind blasted through the narrow gap. Ethan collapsed against the stone wall, gasping for breath while the earth trembled around him. Outside, entire trees vanished beneath moving snow. The storm screamed through the valley for what felt like forever before the noise slowly faded into silence again. Ethan closed his eyes for one exhausted moment, trying to steady his breathing. Then he realized something strange. The moose was standing at the entrance of the shelter instead of hiding inside it, watching the storm, watching the forest, as if it knew the danger outside was not over yet. The silence after the avalanche felt wrong. Not peaceful, not safe, just empty in a way that made Ethan's chest tighten every time the wind brushed past the rocks outside the shelter. Snow still drifted through the narrow opening in thin white streams, but the roar of the mountain was gone now. Somewhere beyond the storm, entire sections of forest had disappeared beneath tons of frozen snow. Ethan sat against the stone wall, trying to steady the shaking in his hands. His breathing came in short, uneven bursts. He could feel the cold spreading deeper into his body despite the shelter protecting him from the worst of the wind. His soaked pant leg had started freezing solid around his injured ankle. Every few seconds, a sharp pulse of pain shot upward through his leg before fading again into numbness. He knew enough about extreme cold to understand what that meant. His body was losing the fight to stay warm. The moose still stood near the entrance, unmoving except for the slow rise and fall of its breath. Frost covered its enormous shoulders. Snow clung to the tangled fur around its neck. Yet the animal remained completely alert, staring into the storm as if expecting something to emerge from it at any second. Ethan followed its gaze but saw only darkness and blowing snow between the trees. Then he noticed something else. The moose was limping slightly. One of its back legs barely touched the ground. Ethan frowned through the exhaustion. The animal had already been injured before finding him. Maybe from another storm. Maybe from the tigers. Yet somehow it had still led him away from the avalanche. The realization settled heavily into his chest. None of this made sense anymore. Wild animals did not protect strangers in places like this. Survival here was brutal and simple. Every creature fought for itself. Yet this enormous animal had stayed beside him through every danger so far, instead of disappearing into the forest. Ethan slowly removed one glove and immediately regretted it. The cold slammed into his bare skin so fast it felt unreal. He reached into his backpack carefully and pulled out the small emergency flare he still carried inside a waterproof pouch. One flare left. His final backup if rescue crews ever came close enough to see it. He stared at it for a moment before putting it beside him on the stone floor. Then he noticed movement outside. The moose reacted instantly, lowering its head toward the storm. Ethan's heart started pounding again. At first he thought the tigers had returned, but this movement was different. Smaller. Faster. Snow shifted between the trees about 50 yards from the shelter entrance. Then another shape appeared farther back. Ethan narrowed his eyes through the blowing snow and finally understood what he was seeing. Wolves. A pack moving cautiously along the outer edge of the avalanche debris. They were not charging toward the shelter. They were searching, drawn by the chaos and scent left behind by the storm. The moose took one slow step forward until its entire body blocked the narrow opening completely. Ethan watched the animal carefully now. There was no panic in it. No fear. Just quiet focus. Outside, the wolves stopped moving. Several pairs of pale eyes reflected faintly through the darkness before disappearing again into the forest. Minutes passed. Maybe longer. Time felt strange in the freezing silence. Ethan leaned his head carefully against the stone wall, exhaustion dragging at him harder than ever now. His eyelids felt heavy. Too heavy. Somewhere deep inside, a dangerous warmth had started spreading through his body. He remembered reading about that too. People close to freezing sometimes stop feeling cold entirely. They became sleepy, calm, ready to rest. Ethan forced his eyes open again immediately. Across the shelter, the moose turned its head slightly toward him, as if the animal somehow understood exactly what was happening. Ethan understood something terrifying inside that frozen shelter. The cold was no longer the worst danger. Exhaustion was. The human body could only fight temperatures like this for so long before instinct itself began turning against you. Every part of him wanted to close his eyes. Just for a minute. Just long enough to rest. But people who rested out here did not wake up again. He forced himself to sit upright and slapped feeling back into his numb hands while icy wind hissed through cracks in the rocks around them. Outside, the storm had weakened slightly, but the forest remained buried beneath darkness and drifting snow. Somewhere far away a tree cracked loudly under the weight of ice. The sound echoed through the valley before disappearing into silence again. The wolves had vanished for now, but Ethan knew predators rarely wandered far from weakness. And right now weakness was exactly what he smelled like. Blood. Cold. Fear. The moose finally stepped away from the shelter entrance after standing guard for what felt like hours. The giant animal moved deeper inside carefully, favoring its injured back leg. Up close, Ethan could now see the damage more clearly. One side of the moose's thick fur was matted with frozen blood beneath layers of ice. Long claw marks stretched across its shoulder, old enough to partially freeze over, but fresh enough that the animal still struggled to put full weight on one leg. Ethan stared quietly. So that was it. The moose had already survived an encounter with the tigers before crossing paths with him. Somehow the realization made the animal seem even more unreal. It should have disappeared into the wilderness after surviving something like that. Instead, it had chosen to stay beside a freezing stranger who could barely walk. The moose lowered itself slowly onto the frozen ground near the shelter wall. Steam rose faintly from its body into the freezing air. Ethan could hear its breathing now. Slow, deep, exhausted. For a long moment, neither of them moved. The storm outside continued whispering through the rocks while snow drifted past the narrow opening like white smoke. Ethan reached carefully into his backpack again and found the last energy bar buried near the bottom. It was frozen almost solid. He stared at it for several seconds before breaking off a small piece with stiff fingers. The rest he placed carefully on the ground several feet away from the moose. The animal watched him but did not move toward the food. Ethan gave a tired laugh under his breath. Even now, starving and injured, the giant creature still looked more cautious than desperate. His laughter faded quickly though when another sound rolled faintly across the forest outside. Not wolves this time. Not the avalanche either. A howl. Long, deep. Much farther away than before. Then another answered from somewhere closer. Ethan's stomach tightened immediately. The wolves were gathering again. The moose lifted its head instantly toward the entrance. Every muscle in its massive body tensed despite the exhaustion weighing on it. Ethan forced himself to stand, gripping the stone wall for balance while pain shot through his ankle again. He limped toward the narrow opening and carefully looked outside. The storm clouds had shifted enough for moonlight to faintly touch the snowfields beyond the trees. And there, barely visible between the drifting snow, shapes were moving again. More than before. Ethan counted at least 6 wolves circling the outer edge of the valley now, watching the shelter from a distance. Waiting. The worst part was how patient they looked. They were not afraid of the moose anymore. They were waiting for weakness to win. Ethan stepped backward slowly, heart pounding harder with every breath. Then the moose suddenly rose to its feet again and stared toward the deeper forest beyond the wolves. Its ears lifted sharply. Ethan followed its gaze into the darkness just as 2 enormous amber eyes appeared between the trees. The amber eyes did not move. They remained perfectly still between the snow-covered trees, low and patient beneath the drifting moonlight. Ethan felt the air leave his lungs slowly as another pair appeared farther behind the first. Then another. The tigers had returned, and this time they were closer than ever before. The wolves vanished almost immediately from the outer edge of the valley. Even predators understood when something more dangerous entered the forest. Ethan stepped backward instinctively until his shoulders pressed against the frozen rock wall behind him. The moose remained near the shelter entrance, massive antlers stretching wide enough to nearly block the narrow opening completely. Snow drifted across its dark fur while steam rose from its body into the freezing night air. The animal looked exhausted now. Ethan could see it clearly. Its injured leg trembled slightly beneath its weight, yet it still refused to retreat deeper into the shelter. It stood facing the trees instead, facing the tigers. One of the large shapes moved slowly through the storm, stepping into clearer view beneath the moonlight. Ethan had never seen anything like it in person before. The tiger looked enormous against the snow, its thick winter coat glowing faintly orange beneath layers of frost. It walked with terrifying calm, each movement smooth and silent despite the deep snow. The animal stopped less than 60 feet from the shelter and stared directly at them. Ethan's heartbeat pounded so loudly he could hear it over the wind. He searched frantically around the shelter for anything useful. A weapon, a tool, anything. But there was nothing except ice-covered stone and his nearly empty backpack. The emergency flare still rested beside the wall where he had left it earlier. One flare against the Siberian wilderness. It suddenly felt very small. Outside, the tiger lowered its head slightly, while another shape circled farther through the trees behind it. Ethan realized they were spreading out again, cutting off the valley little by little. The storm had trapped everything together inside this frozen place. The wolves, the tigers, him, the moose. And now there was nowhere left to run. The moose suddenly stomped the ground hard enough to shake snow from the rocks above the shelter entrance. The sound echoed sharply through the valley. The nearest tiger paused immediately. For several long seconds, neither animal moved at all. The tension between them felt almost unreal, like the entire forest itself had gone silent to watch. Then Ethan noticed something else. The moose was positioning itself differently now, not just guarding the shelter entrance anymore. It was standing slightly farther outside than before, creating distance between the predators and Ethan. The realization hit him slowly and heavily. The animal was preparing itself. Ethan swallowed hard and tightened his grip around the emergency flare. The temperature kept dropping as clouds drifted across the moon again, burying the valley back in darkness. Snowflakes swirled through the trees in endless white spirals while the tiger took another slow step forward. Then another. The moose lowered its massive antlers. Ethan's body tensed instantly. But before anything could happen, a new sound suddenly echoed across the valley. Faint at first, then clearer. Mechanical. Ethan froze in disbelief. Somewhere far beyond the mountains, barely audible beneath the storm, came the distant chopping sound of helicopter blades. Rescue crews. His chest filled with hope so fast it almost hurt. But the tigers had heard it too. The nearest one lifted its head toward the sound, while the others disappeared silently into the trees again. Ethan grabbed the flare immediately and stumbled toward the shelter entrance, desperate to signal the aircraft before it passed too far away. But the moment he stepped into the snow, the moose turned sharply toward him and blocked his path. Ethan nearly fell backward when the moose blocked him. The giant animal moved faster than he expected, stepping directly into his path until its enormous body filled the shelter entrance again. Snow swirled around its antlers while the sound of the helicopter echoed faintly through the mountains beyond the storm. Ethan tightened his grip around the emergency flare in disbelief. Rescue was close. So close he could almost feel warmth already. Yet the moose refused to let him leave the shelter. For one confused second, Ethan felt frustration rise through the exhaustion. Then he saw it. Movement behind the trees to the left side of the valley. One of the tigers had not retreated at all. It remained low in the snow, barely 30 yards away, nearly invisible against the darkness except for its eyes. Waiting. The helicopter noise had distracted Ethan just long enough for the predator to move closer. The moose had seen it first. Ethan slowly stepped backward again while his heartbeat pounded against his ribs. The tiger stared at them without moving, its breath rising faintly into the freezing air. Somewhere deeper in the forest, another low growl answered through the storm. They were still surrounding the valley. The helicopter sound drifted farther away for a moment as wind shifted across the mountains. Panic tightened in Ethan's chest instantly. If the aircraft passed beyond the ridge without seeing him, he would not survive another night out here. The cold had already pushed his body too far. His fingers barely worked anymore. Even holding the flare felt difficult now. The moose suddenly turned its head toward the mountain slope above the valley. Ethan followed its gaze and noticed something strange through the drifting snow. A narrow clearing cut between the trees farther uphill where the storm clouds appeared thinner. Open sky. The helicopter would have a much better chance of seeing a flare there. The moose stepped away from the shelter entrance and began limping slowly toward the slope. Ethan stared after it for one stunned moment before realizing the animal was leading him again. Another growl rolled through the trees behind them. Closer this time. Ethan shoved the flare into his jacket and forced himself to follow. Every step through the snow sent pain through his injured ankle, but adrenaline kept him moving. The moose pushed ahead through the storm, leaving deep tracks across the valley while moonlight flickered faintly through gaps in the clouds above. Ethan limped after the giant silhouette as fast as he could. Behind them, shadows moved silently between the trees. The tigers were following now. Not rushing. Not attacking. Just waiting for weakness. The climb grew steeper as they moved higher along the ridge. Ethan's breathing became ragged almost immediately. The freezing air tore through his lungs while dizziness blurred the edges of his vision. Several times he nearly collapsed into the snow completely. Each time the moose stopped ahead and waited. It never disappeared into the storm, no matter how slow Ethan became. Finally, they reached the clearing near the ridge top. Wind blasted across the open slope hard enough to almost knock Ethan off balance. But above them, the clouds had broken apart just enough to reveal dark sky overhead. Then Ethan heard it again. Louder now. Helicopter blades echoing somewhere beyond the mountain. He pulled the emergency flare from his jacket with trembling hands and struck it alive. Bright red light exploded against the snow, painting the entire ridge in crimson. Ethan raised it toward the sky desperately while smoke whipped sideways through the freezing wind. For one brief moment, hope surged through him stronger than fear. Then the moose suddenly lowered its antlers toward the tree line behind them. Ethan turned slowly and saw multiple shapes emerging from the forest at once. The red flare hissed violently against the storm, throwing crimson light across the ridge while the shapes below emerged from the darkness one by one. Ethan counted 3 tigers now standing near the edge of the trees, their massive forms barely visible through drifting snow. They did not rush forward. They simply watched the ridge in complete silence while the flare smoke twisted upward into the night sky. The bull moose stepped farther in front of Ethan, lowering its enormous antlers toward the predators again. Steam rolled from its nostrils in thick, white clouds. The injured leg trembled beneath its weight now, but the animal still refused to back away. Ethan could hear the helicopter more clearly overhead. Somewhere beyond the clouds, rescue crews were close enough now that the sound echoed across the mountains. He raised the flare higher and shouted into the storm with what little strength remained in his chest. His voice disappeared instantly into the wind. The tigers below remained perfectly still, waiting, watching. Then suddenly the helicopter sound shifted direction. Ethan's heart nearly stopped. The aircraft was turning away. Panic flooded through him, so hard his knees almost gave out beneath the cold. He waved the flare desperately through the darkness while sparks scattered across the snow around him. The red light flickered violently in the wind. For one terrible second nothing changed. Then a bright searchlight suddenly cut through the storm clouds above the valley. Ethan shielded his eyes instantly as the beam swept across the ridge. The helicopter had seen the flare. Relief crashed through his body, so hard it almost felt painful. The tigers reacted immediately. One vanished back into the forest while another retreated slowly between the snow-covered pines. The third remained motionless for a few seconds longer before finally disappearing into the darkness as well. The wilderness swallowed them completely. Ethan lowered the flare slowly, breathing hard while the helicopter circled closer overhead. Snow blasted sideways across the ridge beneath the aircraft blades. The searchlight locked onto him now, turning the frozen mountainside bright white against the night. Ethan turned toward the moose instinctively, ready to see the giant animal standing beside him one last time. But the ridge behind him was empty. The bull moose was gone. Ethan stared into the swirling snow in disbelief. There were no sounds except the helicopter and the wind. No dark silhouette. No antlers. Nothing. It had disappeared back into the storm sometime during the chaos without him noticing. Rescue workers reached Ethan minutes later, wrapping him in thermal blankets while asking questions he barely understood through the exhaustion. But Ethan kept staring toward the forest below the ridge. Even as they lifted him toward the helicopter, he searched the storm one final time, hoping to catch another glimpse of the giant animal that had stayed beside him through the impossible cold. He never saw it again. Days later, after doctors treated the frostbite in his hands and ankle, rescue teams returned to the valley searching